Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be asking the question, has the Bible been changed in our continuing study of apologetics? Perhaps when you were a child, you played the game telephone where someone told a secret to someone else, and they told the secret to a third person and a fourth and a fifth, and they went around the room, and by the time you got to the end of the room, what had been told had been changed. It was completely beyond recognition. And people have actually asked the question, is the Bible like that? As God spoke to the apostles or the prophets, they wrote down, but then did it get changed as it was passed on from person to person, either in the writing or in the translation? And notice we're going to cover this under two heads, both the copying as well as the translating. When we speak of God having spoken to or through the writers, for example, the apostles in the New Testament, the prophets in the Old Testament, that revealing of himself, that's called revelation. God revealed himself. But then we go one step further, that as the apostles or the prophets wrote down what had been given to them, we call that inspiration. The Bible actually speaks about how the scriptures themselves, not just where they did the best job they could in writing it down, but that the scriptures themselves are inspired by God to describe that. I think we've discussed already how Paul coins a word, theopneustos, God breathed, that God actually worked in and through those writers to bring about his word. And so I take the position of what we call verbal plenary inspiration. That is, the words themselves were inspired. But that still leaves the question, what about how those words were taken and either copied or translated into other languages? And so the word had to the written text had to be copied. This idea of copying the text, and this happened over many hundreds of years. Remember, they didn't have copy machines; they couldn't just collate and print a number of copies. Each copy had to be hand copied. And if you've ever had any experience at copying something by hand, you know that it's possible to to make a mistake, a typo, as you're copying, especially a long document. It's easy if you're doing maybe two or three words or a telephone number. But think about the times you've even copied a telephone number and you've made a mistake in in either missing a number or in putting the wrong number and bringing in that sort of typo. So that we have the original manuscripts, but we don't have those. All we have is copies, and usually what we have is copies of copies of copies of copies. And so you can see how the issue would arise. Now, the good news is that we don't have just 5 copies or 10 copies or 20 copies. What we have is many more than that, not just 100 or 1,000. We have of the New Testament alone, it's over 5,000 copies of various manuscripts. Now, some of those are good copies, some of those are not so good. Some of those are very old, some of those are not quite as old. Once you hit the year around 1552, you didn't need copies anymore because now they had the printing press. And so you didn't have to have handwritten copies. But you have a great many copies. When we come to the Old Testament, the same thing goes true. We have a great many handwritten copies of the Old Testament Hebrew text. Although when they found back in 1947, some shepherd boys were by the edge of the Dead Sea in the caves up around the northwestern side of the Dead Sea, and they came across some scrolls. Later on, scientists went back and looked in a great many more of those caves and found a great many more scrolls, what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in that single find, the age of the copies went back 1,000 years earlier than the oldest copy that we had. I think one of the oldest copies we had at that time was the Leningrad Codex, dating to about 1,100. No, actually about 1,000 years ago. But then, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they went back another 1,000 and more years, where there were copies of the Old Testament that were found that were 150, 200 years before Jesus. That's how old some of those copies were. So we've got a great many copies and a great many ancient copies of those manuscripts. Now, the examination of those manuscripts, and this is actually a science, we call it textual criticism, is the scholarly work with available manuscripts, and nowadays we have a great many available manuscripts since archaeology has brought so many to light. It is scholarly work with available manuscripts aimed at the recovery within limits of possibility of the original text, and it really is both a science and an art. It's actually an area where I've taken college and seminary classes on the subject of textual criticism on how to do that scholarly work. Now, here's one biblical example. This is a possible biblical example. I put a question mark behind it. Joshua chapter 24 and verse 30, where speaking of the death of Joshua, they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath Serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim on the north of Mount Gaash. And then we compare this not with other manuscripts, but actually just with the book of Judges, the parallel passage in the book of Judges, where they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath Heres. And did you notice the slight difference? Timnath Serah versus Timnath Heres still in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Notice in the Joshua passage we have Timnath Serah, and I'm giving you the Hebrew. I'm just notice the shape of the letters. This will become evident in a second, even if you can't read the Hebrew. In Judges chapter 2, verse 9, it's Timnath Heres. And notice what's happened. If you look at the shape of those three Hebrew letters, all that's happened is the first and last letter has been reversed between Joshua and Judges. Now, it's entirely possible that the place had two different names. It was just the reverse of those letters. But I think probably what happened is either the copyist who was writing Joshua or else the copyist who was writing Judges inadvertently switched those two letters around and it wasn't caught. And notice what's happened. It's in our Hebrew manuscript, not just the Hebrew manuscript we use, but even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the same thing. In our oldest copies, those two words are switched. And notice that no one ever made an attempt to harmonize the two passages. Hebrew scribes that were copying these two texts, of course, they recognized that there was a difference, but they left it as is. They didn't try to change one or the other. They just left it as is and copied it, even though those two terms are different in each passage. Something similar takes place in 1 Kings chapter 24 and verse 8, where Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king. We're not going to look at the Hebrew here. We're just going to read the translation. And he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And then we compare this with the parallel passage over in 2 Chronicles, where Jehoiachin was, instead of 18 years, he was 8 years old when he became king. Well, was he 8 or 18? Now, again, Hebrew scribes knew that one of these passages evidently was a typo, and when you're doing numbers, sometimes it's easy to make a mistake. And that someone in the distant past, some scribe in the past, had made a mistake, but they didn't know, was it the one in Second Kings or was it the one in Second Chronicles? Which one was erroneous? They probably had their theory, but they said, we're not going to change it. We're going to leave it because we don't want to change the word of God. And so they left what was obviously a typo in one of these two passages. And again, what they're showing is how faithful they were in copying the text, even even when they thought, well, no, one of these is a typo, but we're not going to try to fix it. We're going to leave it as is. And in doing so, they showed us their faithfulness to the text that they had. And that's a good thing. Now, there's different types of textual alterations. First of all, there's unintentional errors from faulty eyesight. I think we've looked at some possibilities. Let's go to the New Testament and see another one. This is from 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16, where and notice the first line says God, and then I gave you actually the Hebrew theos is the word for God, but sometimes it would be abbreviated in New Testament texts. They didn't do this so much in the Old Testament with the Hebrew, but sometimes they did this in the Greek, where they would abbreviate instead of writing out theos, they just put the theta and the sigma, the first letter and the last letter, as notice it's given here. And the passage goes on to say he was manifest in the flesh. There are some manuscripts, a few older manuscripts, that say instead of theos or thought, with the abbreviation, he, that is Has, was manifested in the flesh. And notice the difference between these two. The theos it looks like a zero, but it's not. That's a theta. But what sets it apart is that it has a little line going through the middle, and then Has, it's an omicron, just doesn't have that line, and that's the difference between these two Greek letters. It's a little bit like the difference between our O versus our Q. Think about the capital O and the capital Q. The only difference is a little squiggly line right at the bottom of the Q, which changes it from an O into a Q. The same thing with these two letters. So I think this was probably an unintentional error. You say, well, which was it? I'm not sure. And the context doesn't really matter because it's talking about God in the context in both readings. And so it really doesn't change the meaning at all. The second type of unintentional error from faulty hearing. Now, it's been theorized, I'm not sure if this is true, that you would have the situation of a scribe who was reading the text and others who were copying, but we don't actually know of any cases where scribes actually did this. The great majority of times that we know about, the scribes would have a copy from which they were copying, and they wouldn't just hear the text unless they read it themselves. Now, that's entirely possible where a scribe might be reading the text out loud. The idea of reading silently was something that we do today, but throughout most of history, that was not a thing. And so he might have been reading the text out loud, and in reading it, mispronounced, and then that caused him to write a wrong thing. That's entirely possible. So faulty hearing, but I'm going to equate that also an error from the mind as he reads the word, but then either you know how sometimes when you say a word that sounds like another word, you make a mistake in writing it down. And a case like this might be found in Mark chapter 14, verse 65. This is talking about the soldiers that take Jesus and they're beating him, and they took elabon is the Greek word there. They took their fists, or there's some manuscripts that say instead of elabon, it says abalon. Notice it's easy to confuse one with the other. It sounds alike. Where they threw their fists, and you say, well, which is it? In either case, they were beating him with their fists. Whether they were taking their fists or throwing their fists, it doesn't change the meaning of the passage. But there is a scribal alteration that has been made where we have manuscripts with the different readings, where one set of manuscripts has one reading and another set has another reading. Now, in some cases, the alternate reading is obviously not the case. For example, if we were reading a copy of the United States Constitution and we read, "We, the people of the United States, in order to secure a more perfect onion." You say, well, that doesn't fit. We know that's not right. Evidently, they were trying to say, in order to secure a more perfect union, and somebody just wrote down the wrong letter. That was an obvious typo. And yeah, within the copies of the scriptures, sometimes there are some very obvious typos. Doesn't happen a lot, but occasionally, and that's not a bad thing. That actually makes it easier because we know what was supposed to be written there. It's very obvious when it's that kind of unintentional error. It's a little bit harder when either reading does make sense. So another type of error can be when you have the omission of certain letters or sometimes even a word. This is seen in Luke chapter 8, verse 20, where some manuscripts will say, and it was told to him, and then what was told to him comes next. But we actually have some other manuscripts where it reads, and it was told to him saying, and then you have the what was being said. Notice the word saying was unintentionally, I think, it was omitted or added. Um, and again, it doesn't change the meaning of the passage because in both passages, something was said, and then what was said goes on in the rest of the passage. But just that word saying it, yes, that's a real difference. It's a significant difference, but it doesn't change the overall meaning of the passage. And so those are some of the unintentional errors. Finally, we have The possibility, I can't think of too many examples where this takes place, but the misreading of personal notes, if you're like me, sometimes you'll write in the Bible and you'll add a little notation in the margin. And that's not a new thing. Going to look at, and now this is actually from the Codex Vaticanus, a very, very polished manuscript, professionally copied. But notice in the black outline, and we have a blow up off to the side, where there is a marginal note that's been placed in the margin between the two columns, and we can actually read that. You need to sort of look at it with a magnifying glass, and what we've got is a translation, fool and knave. I probably wouldn't have translated cockeye as knave. I think I would have said fool and bad person, but I guess that's a knave, so that works. Uh, Leave the old reading and do not change it. And so here's a marginal note saying, look, I know that some of you have been thinking, you've been comparing manuscripts and you want to correct the manuscript. Don't do that. And so can you imagine somebody coming along at a later date and copying this manuscript and thinking that phrase, fool and knave, leave the old reading and do not change it, was part of the original text, and by mistake, copying that into the text. And so I suppose things like that are possible. They're very rare, but things like that can happen. That's one of the possibilities. Now, all of those were unintentional errors. Next, we want to look at some intentional changes, and I think there have been a few of those. Sometimes there have been spelling and grammatical updates. When I first started school, I started school in England and our family lived there for a few years, and then we moved back to the United States. And there are a few words that in the English of England, you spell differently than you spell here in the United States. The meaning of the words are the same, but you spell them slightly differently. And there are a few times when we can tell that a manuscript has been updated because words weren't, the spelling of the word might have changed, or sometimes the actual grammar had changed to the point where that word isn't the word we use anymore to say that. And so there have been a couple places. I think there's one or two places, maybe in the Isaiah scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where one of the Isaiah scrolls actually has two different places where the word's been updated because the way they use that word had changed over the years, and they're trying to make the scriptures understandable. So I think there's two places in the Isaiah scroll where that takes place. There were actually two Isaiah scrolls in the original Dead Sea Scrolls when they first found them. Another example of this is the modernization of names and places. Again, I think this takes place. For example, if I asked you, have you ever been to New Amsterdam? And you say, well, where's that? Well, that's what they used to call New York City, but we don't call it that anymore. And there seem to have been a few places where a name or names of places or even of people maybe, but mostly of places, have been updated so that the later readers can understand what was taking place. There's a few things like this that seem to be in the book of Acts where there's a little tiny notation that talks about this city or this place and maybe changes the name of it because that's what we call it nowadays. Sometimes there have been, and now we were looking at two examples in the Old Testament where the scribes resisted any attempted harmonization, but in the New Testament, there are one or two places where that apparently has taken place, attempted harmonization. And so what we do is we examine all the copies that we have, and the older copies especially might not reflect that later harmonization that takes place. Um, my old Hebrew exegesis professor, Dr. Laird Harris, gave this quote. Now, he wrote this quite a long time ago. He says, "It thus develops that we do not have an embarrassing welter of 3,000 manuscripts. Actually, nowadays it's more than 5,000. Quite a few more have been discovered since he wrote that. But he goes on to say of 3,000 manuscripts disagreeing in confusing ways, but that these manuscripts have been copied with considerable care from a few old and standard editions." In other words, there's not just a wealth of changes all throughout, but actually we can collate and understand where a great many of these came from, and we can actually group them into manuscript families, and that works quite nicely. Now, when we look at all of the different variants, and this is right now just looking at New Testament manuscripts, notice, and I have a sort of a graph showing how many, the great majority are just spelling. Here I put spelling errors, might be spelling differences. Remember, they didn't have dictionaries back then, so you might have one or two or three proper ways to spell a single word. And even that's been taking place in English as English has been changing. There are certain words that we spell one or two or three different ways, and if you look it up in the dictionary, they will list two or three different proper ways to spell a single word. Well, that happened in the New Testament as well. So those sorts of spelling, I put errors here. Maybe I should have put spelling differences. And then secondly, the second most common variant is those variants that don't actually affect the translation. We would translate it the same way, but you might actually have a different Greek word that was used in that. And so again, that doesn't change your English translation. It means the same in either case. Then the third type of change, notice much rarer, are the meaningful but not variable variants. In other words, like we described before, in order to form a more perfect onion. Well, that's obviously not the case. And so we have a few of those that crept into the text, typos, and they're very obvious typos because they wouldn't make any sense. And it's easy to look at them and to see what the writer was trying to say. In As a professor, I grade my students' papers, and there are many times where I can see what the student was trying to say, but he misspelled it or left out a word or something like that, and it was very obvious what the error was. So meaningful but not viable variants. And then the fourth type, and of the variants, these are in the minority, but there are some of these where they are both meaningful and viable. That is, it could have gone either way, and they would both fit and both make sense. And there are a few places where that takes place. It doesn't change any major doctrine or anything like that, but sometimes it might change the nuance of a verse or something like that, where they both might fit, and that would be okay. So notice we went from Revelation, God working in the lives of the individual authors, and then them writing, and then copies, a great many copies being made. But from here now we go to the issue of translation. And again, the Bible has been translated and retranslated, and you say, well, with each translation, don't we lose some meaning? But each translation that's made isn't made from the previous translation. That's not how scholars have gone about. Instead, each one goes back to the Greek or to the Hebrew text, Hebrew in the Old Testament, Greek in the New Testament, and goes back and retranslates it. So it's not a case of translating from a translating from a translation from a translation from a translation, but that each translation has gone back individually and separately and independently, gone back to the Greek in the New Testament and the Hebrew in the Old Testament. And so what we have is the work of many different, even independent translators. Now, when we look at, and here I'm just looking at some of the popular English translations. We could put out a chart like this in German or in Portuguese or in a great many different languages. But this is just looking at some of the popular English translations. And notice there's sort of a broad spectrum. Way over on the right, you have the Message Bible, which, in my opinion, is more of a paraphrase, trying to give you the general thoughts. The Living Bible does sort of the same thing. But then the further I move to the left, notice that's a functional equivalence. But then I go through dynamic equivalence, and here the NIV, that stands for the New International Version, or the NLT is the New Living Translation. In both of those cases, they're trying to give us, and they're going back to the Greek and the Hebrew. Those are actually translations, not like the Living Bible or the Message, that are actually they're actually just taking it from the English and trying to update the language. But all of these others are actually translations, the New International Version, the New Living Translation. With the dynamic equivalent, they're not really trying to go word for word. They're trying to give you the general idea. Sometimes when you go word for word, you actually miss the meaning. because there are figures of speech and things like that you just can't translate word for word. If you know two different languages, you know this already. If you're if you're monolingual, you might not have run into this, but if you're at least bilingual, you can speak two or more languages. You know this inherently that you cannot. Uh, in fact, there's many times you cannot go from word to word. It just won't work. But there are translations that have tried to go in that direction. Notice the ones over on the left, the formal equivalent translations, translations like the King James Version. And for the King James, I'd say especially in the Old Testament, it was different teams that translated each section. And the Old Testament translators for the King James were very, very literal. In their attempt. The New King James Version does the same thing, maybe not quite so much. The English Standard Version, the ESV, and in my opinion, the most literal. Well, I guess an interlinear would be the most. If you've ever seen an interlinear, that actually has the Greek or the Hebrew, and then they'll actually try to put a word or phrase under each word. But it's almost impossible to read. It's very, very difficult to read because the structure of Greek and especially the structure of Hebrew are so very different. Actually, both languages are so very different than English. So it almost doesn't make any sense when you try to read an interlinear, unless you can actually read some Greek and Hebrew, then it can be helpful. But the New American Standard Version, um, the NASB, actually it gets very close to this. It's the most literal and readable. It actually sacrifices a little bit of readability, perhaps. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to read. But they really do make an honest attempt at this, at trying to be as close as possible to word for word. Of course, again, you can't do it all the time. And sometimes if you did it, you'd actually lose the meaning behind it. Now, let me define our terms. And so a transliteration, that's a rendering of the words of the original language into the same words with the translated alphabet. Obviously, the Hebrew and Greek each have different alphabets than what we use for our English alphabet. So that there are certain names like Jordan and Israel. In fact, whenever you see any name in either the Old or New Testament with the letter J, that's been changed a little bit. So they didn't call it the Jordan; they called it the Jordan. Notice with a Y or actually a Yod in Hebrew. They did not have the letter J or even the sound of the letter J in either Greek or Hebrew. So if you read either Jordan or Jehoshaphat or Jesus, that's actually been anglicized. Those names have been updated a bit. So names these names are translated and maybe sometimes a little bit anglicized just so that we can read them and understand them. Or you have certain words which actually were taken from either Greek or Hebrew. Angel actually comes from the Greek word angelos, which means either messenger or maybe a divine messenger like an angel. Our word baptize comes from baptizo, another Greek word that describes, the idea of, well, it's just the same idea that we have of baptism, but always carries with that idea identifying somebody with the thing into which they're being baptized. The word canon, we already noted that it actually comes from the Greek word kanon, or Messiah. That comes from a Hebrew word, Mashiach. It's anglicized a bit, but one who's been anointed. So these words we all get that they're transliterated from a different language, and then a version of the Bible, like the King James Version or the New American Standard Version. These are translations from the original language, either Greek, if it's New Testament, Hebrew, if it's Old Testament. There's actually a few chapters in the Old Testament that are from Aramaic, which is a language somewhat close to Hebrew. And then finally, we can talk about a revision. A revision is the reworking of a previous translation. But again, they would go back to the Greek, if it's New Testament, back to the Hebrew, and consult those languages. So it turns out, and we'll close on this note, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 25, but the word of the Lord endures forever, and this is the word which was preached to you. We can trust the word of God. It has been preached. It has been, yes, copied and translated, but those translations and those copies are a faithful and accurate and helpful and good reproduction of the message that was given to us by the Lord.